Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The heat was a hammer, beating the dust of the unpaved street into a fine choking powder that settled on everything. A pale ghost of the winter to come, for the townsfolk of promise. The heat was a temporary torment, a final siege before the relief of autumn. For Anya Jensen, it was a clock, and every shimmering wave rising from the parched earth was another tick towards a future she could not yet see, but deeply feared. She was a widow, a word that sat on her as heavily as the humid air. A garment she had not chosen but could not take off. Her husband, Eric, had been a well-digger, a man who understood the secret language of soil and stone. He had come to this row-bone land with promises of his own, a belief that water, the lifeblood of any settlement, would be his fortune. He had bought a small plot just outside of town, a scrabble of rock and thin grass that no one else wanted, and he had begun to dig. He was looking for water. He found only his grave. A sudden collapse. A torrent of dry earth, and Eric, the man who listened to the deep ground, was silenced by it forever. He left her with the land, a half-finished shack that was little more than a collection of boards arguing with the wind, and the well. The well was his monument and her inheritance. A perfectly circular, timber-shored shaft dropping 40 feet into the unyielding Dakota bedrock. It was also bone dry, a testament to a failed gamble. The town pitied her, of course. A woman alone, a foreigner with a quiet tongue and eyes that seemed to hold the gray of a northern sea, left with nothing but a hole in the ground. Their pity was a thin blanket, soon to be worn through by the coming frost. Anya knew the whispers that followed her when she went to the mercantile for flour and salt. Liability, they murmured. She'll be on the church's charity by first snow, Mr. Silas Croft, the town's preeminent builder and owner of the lumber mill. A man whose voice carried the authority of hammered nails and squared logs, had made his assessment clear that shack won't survive a real blizzard, and the land's useless. Nothing but a dry well. He was not wrong about the shack. It was a sieve for the wind, a temporary shelter at best. But about the well, about the land, he was profoundly, fundamentally mistaken. He saw a failure. Anya saw a doorway. Eric had not just been a well digger. He was the last in a long line of Danish men who had worked underground, not for water, but for stone and coal in the old country. He had carried the earth in his blood, in the evenings in their small cot. He hadn't told her stories of saints and kings. He told her stories of geology, of thermal gradients, of the way the deep earth held its breath, maintaining a steady, constant temperature, indifferent to the raging fevers of summer or the icy agues of winter. The surface world is a frantic child, he would say, his hands tracing patterns on the rough blanket. It screams with heat. It shrieks with cold. But you go down just a little way, Anya, just past the frost line, and the earth remembers a time before seasons. It keeps a steady heart. One sweltering afternoon, as the town sought refuge in the shade of porches and the cool of the saloon, Anya walked to the edge of the well. She looked down into the dark, perfect circle. It did not smell of damp or decay. It smelled of cool stone and ancient dust. It was not a grave. It was a promise of a different kind. Her decision was not born of desperation or madness, as the town would later claim. It was born of logic, of memory, of Eric's quiet wisdom. She would not build upon the frantic surface. She would not fight the winter. She would step aside and let it pass over her. She tied the rope to the sturdy windlass Eric had built, lit a lantern, and climbed down. The heat of the August sun vanished 10 feet below the rim. By 20 feet, the air was cool and still. At the bottom, 40 feet down, it was like a cellar in late autumn, a deep, profound cool that felt not like the absence of heat, but like a presence of its own. She held the lantern high. The walls were solid, a mix of compacted earth and layered shale. Eric's shoring timbers were expertly placed. He had been a master of his craft. He had not found water, but he had built the perfect entrance. Anya placed her hand against the wall. It was cool, yes, but it was a living cool. She pressed her ear to it, closing her eyes, and listened. She heard nothing but the faint beat of her own heart, and in the deep silence, she felt the steady, unwavering presence of the earth. She was not in a hole. She was in a sanctuary. When she climbed back out, blinking in the aggressive glare of the sun, her path was set. She would not be a liability. She would not beg for charity. She would finish the work Eric had started, not by going deeper, but by going wider. She would carve her home from the earth itself. Her work began the next day. The town watched, first with curiosity, then with bewilderment, and finally with a kind of communal mockery. She was not hauling lumber to reinforce her shack. She was hauling buckets of dirt out of the well. Day after day, the pile of excavated earth beside the well grew. The children gave it a name first, whispered behind cupped hands, the widow's folly. The name stuck. Adults adopted it with a sad shake of the head. Grief does strange things, they'd say. Poor woman's digging her own grave. Anya ignored them. Her world narrowed to the feel of the shovel in her hands, the scent of the deep earth, the rhythm of her own labor at the bottom of the shaft. She began to tunnel horizontally, heading north, away from the path of the winter sun. Eric had taught her how to read the stone, how to follow a seam, how to brace the ceiling as she went. She was not digging wildly. She was excavating with surgical precision. She planned a main living chamber, a smaller sleeping alcove, and a pantry. Each bucket of rock and soil was a victory, hauled up by the hand-cranked windlass, her shoulders and back burning with a clean, honest pain. She was not just building a shelter, she was building a new life, one handful at a time. The confrontation she had known was coming arrived in late September. The aspens in the hills were turning a brilliant, feverish yellow. It's a beautiful warning. Silas Croft rode out to her property, his horse picking its way carefully around the growing mound of earth. He was a large man, made larger by his reputation. He dismounted and stood at the edge of the well, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of stern, paternalistic concern. "Mistress Jensen," he began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "Anya, this has gone on long enough. The town is worried." He gestured vaguely towards promise. "Winter is 2 months away. You are spending your strength on this? This hole, your shack, is falling apart. You have no cordwood to speak of. What is your plan, woman?" "My plan is here," she said, her voice quiet. Patting the stone-dusted ground beside the well, Croft let out an exasperated sigh. "You cannot live in a well. It is a tomb. It will be damp. It will be dark. And the first heavy rain will flood you out. Or worse, it will collapse and bury you. I am a builder. I know these things. I know the land, and I know our winters. This is madness, you know the surface." "Mr. Croft," Anya replied, her gaze unwavering. "You build boxes that sit on the skin of the earth and dare the wind to knock them down. You fight the cold. I do not intend to fight it, and what do you intend?" He scoffed. "To ask it in for tea?" "I intend to be where it is not," she said simply. The simplicity of her statement seemed to enrage him. It was an affront to his expertise, to the entire established wisdom of frontier survival. "You are digging your own grave," he said, his voice dropping. The words meant to be a final, chilling verdict. "You are a danger to yourself, and you are setting a poor example. When you freeze or starve or are buried alive, it will be the town that has to deal with the consequences." Anya looked at the man, at his fine leather boots and his confident posture. He saw a hole, a void, a negative space defined by what it lacked: walls, a roof, a window. He could not see what it possessed. "The earth that takes can also give, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying with the weight of conviction. "You only see one side of the ledger. I am not digging a grave. I am building a root cellar for a human being." He stared at her for a long moment, searching for a crack in her certainty, a flicker of doubt. He found none. He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and disgust, mounted his horse, and rode away. The verdict of the town was sealed. Anya Jensen was a lost cause, a fool succumbing to her grief in the most peculiar and public way possible. Her folly was now her identity. Anya watched him go, then turned back to the well. His words did not sting. They were irrelevant, the buzzing of a fly on the surface world. She had work to do. The community's dismissal was, in its own way, a gift. It left her alone. As October painted the hills in shades of rust and ochre, she completed the main excavation. Her subterranean home was not a damp cave. It was a series of clean, arched chambers carved from the stable shale. The main room was roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, with a ceiling high enough for her to stand comfortably. A sleeping nook branched off one side, just big enough for her cot and a small chest. On the other side, a pantry where the deep earth would keep her meager stores of potatoes, carrots, and salted meat at a perfect, unwavering temperature. The floors were packed earth, swept smooth and covered with the few rugs she owned. The walls were the living rock, cool and solid to the touch. But Anya knew that shelter was more than just a hole. Eric had taught her that a mine without airflow is a tomb. Her home needed to breathe. This was the most crucial part of her design, the detail that the surface dwellers could never comprehend. Miles away from her property, on a small rocky hillock that rose about 30 feet higher than the land around her well, she spent a week digging a second, much smaller shaft. It was only 2 feet in diameter, a narrow chimney of a hole that she lined with carefully fitted stones. It was hard, grueling work, and it looked like nothing at all, a small stone-lined pit on an empty hill. Then came the most difficult task. From the back of her main living chamber, she began to tunnel again, not wide, but narrow. It's large enough for her to crawl through. She was not tunneling aimlessly. She was tunneling towards the chimney shaft on the hill. For weeks, she worked in the claustrophobic dark, pushing a small cart of dirt ahead of her. Guided by a compass and an innate sense of direction inherited from her husband. This was the work of a miner. This was the knowledge that Silas Croft, with all his sawmills and blueprints, could never possess. Finally, after 40 feet of painstaking labor, her shovel broke through into the bottom of the chimney shaft. A column of cool, fresh air flowed into the tunnel, a gentle but persistent sigh from the world above. She had created a lung for her home. Now the system was complete. It was a simple, elegant principle of physics. The main entrance, the well, was at a lower elevation than the new ventilation shaft. The air inside her dwelling, warmed by her body, her lantern, and eventually a small stove, would naturally rise. This warmer, lighter air would be pushed out through the higher ventilation shaft. This outflow, in turn, would create a gentle, steady suction, pulling fresh, cool air down the main well shaft. It was a self-perpetuating passive ventilation system, a convective loop. Her home would constantly be supplied with fresh air without a single draft. This system was the opposite of what plagued the cabins in town. Silas Croft's houses were marvels of frontier carpentry, with tightly notched logs and well-fitted doors, but they were fundamentally at war with themselves. To have a fire in the hearth, you needed air. The fire would suck that air from every crack and crevice in the cabin, pulling frigid drafts across the floor. The heat from the fire went straight up the chimney, a massive, inefficient hole in the roof that bled warmth into the sky. The people inside were caught in a constant, miserable cycle, huddling near a fire that was actively making the rest of the room colder by pulling in the very winter it was meant to fight. They were trying to heat a box that was designed to leak. They were burning through immense stacks of firewood just to maintain a pocket of survivable warmth while their backs remained frozen. Anya's home was different. It did not need to be heated in the same way. It was a vessel sitting within a massive natural insulator. The scientific term was thermal mass. The sheer bulk of the earth around her dwelling acted as a colossal thermal battery. In the summer, it had absorbed months of warmth, a slow, deep process. Now, as the surface world cooled, that stored warmth would slowly, imperceptibly, radiate back into her living space. The earth would not freeze overnight. It would take months for the winter's cold to penetrate more than a few feet down. By the time the deep frost arrived, she would be deep beyond its reach. her home would not be fighting the cold. It would be stabilized by the planet's own immense, predictable warmth. The ground temperature, 40 feet down, would hover around 50 degrees Fahrenheit all winter long. Regardless of whether the air above was 30 degrees or 30 below zero, she installed a small cast-iron stove in the main chamber. Not for survival, but for comfort. Its stovepipe did not exit through a hole in a roof, bleeding heat. Instead, it snaked through a long, stone-lined trench she had dug in the floor before venting into the base of her chimney shaft. This was a final piece of old-world ingenuity. The hot smoke and gases from the fire would travel through this 40-foot subfloor tunnel. A hot smoke flew. As the smoke journeyed towards the exit, it would radiate its heat into the stone lining and the packed earth of the floor. By the time the smoke left the chimney, it would be cool, having surrendered the vast majority of its thermal energy to the mass of her floor. She was, as Eric used to say, making the smoke pay rent. The floor itself would become a gentle, radiant heater. A single small fire for cooking a meal would warm her home for hours. Her woodpile, a laughable fraction of what her neighbors required, would be more than enough. Her home was a system, a living, breathing entity in harmony with the laws of thermodynamics. The town saw a hole in the ground. They saw madness. Anya saw a masterpiece of efficiency, quiet refutation of every assumption they held about survival. She had not dug a grave. She had built a machine for living. November came, and with it the first snows. They were light, beautiful dustings that melted by midday. The townspeople looked at Anya's pathetic shack, now little more than a shed for her tools, and at the smoke that never seemed to rise from her strange chimney, and they shook their heads. The time of reckoning was near. The first real blizzard struck in the second week of December. It was a vicious 2-day storm that dropped a foot of snow and sent temperatures plummeting. The town hunkered down, fed their fires, and emerged cold but triumphant. They had survived the first test. Silas Croft, meeting a neighbor at the mercantile, was heard to remark, "I wonder if the mole woman has frozen yet. We may need to form a party to dig her out come spring." That was not the test. That was merely a rehearsal. The true crucible arrived on the 3rd of January, 1884. It did not come like a normal storm. It arrived like a judgment. The sky, which had been a brilliant clear blue, seemed to drop like a wall of gray slate in the west. The temperature fell 20 degrees in an hour. The wind, which had been a whisper, began to howl, a rising, unholy shriek that scoured the plains. The old-timers would call it the White Hurricane, a blizzard that would become the benchmark for all winters to come. For 3 days and 3 nights, it raged. The world vanished into a churning, blinding chaos of white. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven by winds that shook the foundations of the sturdiest cabins. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees, then 30 degrees, then 40 degrees. With a wind chill, it was a cold that did not just bite, it consumed. It was a cold that could freeze a man solid in minutes. It was a predator, and the town of promise was its prey. Inside Silas Croft's home, the one he had built for his own family as a showpiece of his craft, the battle was desperate. His wife and 2 children were huddled around the great stone fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fire roared, consuming logs at a terrifying rate. But its heat seemed to reach only a few feet into the room. Beyond that small circle of orange light, the cold held absolute dominion. Frost coated the interior walls, tracing the gaps between the logs in intricate, cruel patterns of ice. A cup of water left on the kitchen table froze solid. The windows were opaque, sheets of white. Every blast of wind felt like a physical blow against the house, forcing needles of super-chilled air through microscopic cracks. Croft was constantly stuffing rags into the gaps. He was the most respected builder in the territory, and his home was failing. The cold was inside with them, a silent, deadly guest. He looked at his dwindling woodpile, then at the terrified faces of his family, and for the first time in his life, he felt the icy touch of true fear. Throughout the town, the story was the same. Families huddled together in a single room, abandoning the rest of their houses to the inhuman cold. Livestock, trapped in barns that were little better than windbreaks, began to freeze to death where they stood. The sound of the wind was a constant maddening assault on the nerves, a reminder of the fragility of their shelters, of the thinness of the walls that separated life from death. They were pioneers, hardened and resourceful, but this was a force beyond their experience. Their conventional wisdom, their thick log walls and roaring fires, were proving to be a tragic illusion. They were not masters of this land. They were its prisoners. 40 feet below the howling chaos, Anya Jensen was mending a sock. A single lantern cast a warm, steady glow over her main chamber. A small fire purred in the cast-iron stove, on which a pot of stew simmered, filling the air with the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat. The air was fresh and still, silence broken only by the gentle hiss of the fire and the rhythmic click of her needle. There was no wind. There were no drafts. The temperature in her subterranean home was a stable, comfortable 65 degrees. She had no windows to frost over, no walls to leak the precious heat. The storm raging on the surface, the white hurricane that was terrorizing the town, was an abstraction. She could not hear it. She could not feel it. The 10 yards of solid earth above her head was the most perfect insulation imaginable, an impenetrable shield against the fury of the elements. Her small pantry was cool but not frozen, her provisions secure. She slept soundly in her alcove, warm beneath a single wool blanket. She was not just surviving, she was living. Her quiet confidence, which the town had mistaken for madness, was being vindicated in the most absolute way imaginable. While the world above fought a losing battle against a merciless enemy, Anya sat in the calm, quiet heart of the earth, safe and warm. She was not a mole. She was a seed, dormant and protected, waiting for the spring. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. An unnerving silence fell over the landscape. The world was buried, transformed into a rolling alien terrain of white. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. Chimneys were clogged with snow. Windows were buried. The paths between houses had vanished. When the people of promise began to dig themselves out, the toll of the storm became apparent. Several cabins on the edge of town were found empty, their inhabitants having frozen in a desperate attempt to reach the town center. Dozens of cattle and horses were lost. Every family had a story of terror, of the close brush with death, of the moment they thought the fire would die and the cold would claim them. Silas Croft's family was safe, but his pride was shattered. His woodpile was nearly gone. He had lost 2 of his best horses. His house, his masterpiece, felt like a tomb of ice as he stood. Staring at the wreckage of his world, a single nagging thought burrowed into his mind. The widow. The fool, Anya Jensen, her shack he could see from his porch, was a wreck, half collapsed under the weight of the snow. But what of her hole? Had it been her grave after all? A grim sense of duty, mixed with a sliver of morbid curiosity, compelled him to find out. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat and began the arduous trek through the massive drifts. The snow was waist-deep, and the air was still a painful, crystalline cold. It took him nearly an hour to cover the half-mile to her property. As he expected, the shack was a ruin. The mound of excavated earth was a smooth, white hillock. There was no sign of life. He felt a pang of guilt. He had warned her. They had all warned her. He walked towards the well, preparing himself for what he might find, or rather what he would not find, and then he saw it. A detail so small and so impossible it made him stop in his tracks. Sticking out of a snowdrift where he knew the rocky hillock to be was a thin, stone-lined pipe, and from that pipe a faint, almost invisible, wisp of gray smoke was rising straight up into the still, frigid air. Smoke. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant life. He stumbled towards the wellhead. The entrance was a deep pit in the snow, but it was clear. He peered over the edge. He could see nothing but darkness. "Spod, Mistress Jensen," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Anya." A moment passed. Then a voice floated up from the darkness, calm and untroubled. "Yes, Mr. Croft." He was so stunned he could not speak. A few moments later, her head appeared, then her shoulders, as she climbed the ladder. She emerged into the blinding white world. She wore a simple wool dress and a light shawl. Her cheeks were rosy. She was not shivering. She was not emaciated or terrified. She looked comfortable. As she stood before him, a cloud of warm air, visible as mist in the brutal cold, billowed out of the well shaft behind her. It was like the breath of a living creature. Silas Croft, the master builder, the man of wood and iron, stared at the woman and the impossible warmth emanating from the cold earth. His entire understanding of shelter, of survival, of the very physics of his world, crumbled in that instant. He looked from her calm face to his own half-frozen hands, from the wisp of smoke rising from her hidden chimney to the memory of his own family huddled in fear. Everything he knew was wrong. He took a step forward, his legs unsteady. He could feel the warmth on his face, a gentle wave in the sea of cold. He looked down into the shaft, then back at her. All his arrogance, all his certainty, had been frozen out of him. He was left with only a single, raw, and humbling question. "How?" he asked. The word, a plume of frosted air, a surrender. Anya looked at the broken man before her. She saw no triumph in his defeat, no satisfaction in his humility. She saw a neighbor who was cold. "Come down," she said simply. "I have stew." He followed her down the ladder, descending from the harsh, bright world of failure into the soft, warm darkness of her success. The moment his boots touched the floor, he felt it. The air was not just warm, it was a gentle, enveloping warmth. The floor beneath his feet was not cold earth. It was subtly, miraculously warm. He reached out and placed a trembling hand on the smooth, curved wall. It was cool, but it was not the life-leeching cold of his own frosted walls. It was the neutral, steady temperature of the deep earth. There were no drafts. The silence was absolute. He was standing in the safest, warmest, most secure house he had ever been in. And it had been built with a shovel. She ladled a bowl of hot stew and handed it to him. He ate in silence, the warmth spreading through him, thawing not just his body, but his rigid, dogmatic mind. When he was finished, he looked around the chamber at the elegant simplicity of it all, at the small stove, at the clever flue, at the sheer, undeniable genius of the design. "Show me the principles," he said, his voice full of a reverence it had never held before. And so she did. Without pride or condescension, Anya explained it all. She spoke of thermal mass, of the earth as a battery. She explained the convective loop of her ventilation system, the lung that let her home breathe. She described the hot smoke flue that made the very floor a radiator. She used the simple, practical language Eric had taught her, speaking of the earth, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. Silas Croft, the builder of 100 cabins, became a student, listening to the wisdom of the mole woman, the foolish widow who had understood something essential that he had missed his entire life. When he climbed back out of the well an hour later, he was a changed man. He did not just see a hole in the ground. He saw the future. Word spread quickly through the devastated town. Silas Croft, the pillar of the community, the ultimate skeptic, had become Anya's first convert. He brought others to see, one by one. Townspeople descended the ladder into her home, emerging minutes later with looks of stunned revelation. They felt the warmth. They breathed the fresh air. They stood in the quiet and understood. Their mockery turned to awe, their pity to profound respect. The widow's folly became known as Anya's method. They came not to mock, but to learn. Anya shared her knowledge freely. She held no grudges. She saw their earlier scorn not as a personal attack, but as a form of blindness. And now they could see, with Silas Croft, as her foreman and most eager student, they began to adapt her designs. The next summer, no one was building log cabins. They were digging. They built homes into the sides of hills using the principles of earth, sheltering. They learned to create ventilation shafts, to build hot smoke flues. They called them dugouts, but they were not the damp, miserable hovels of the poorest sodbusters. They were warm, dry, and efficient marvels of frontier engineering. Anya Jensen, the quiet outsider, the liability, became the most respected person in the territory. She was no longer the widow, the foreigner. She was the founder. She had given them more than a new way to build. She had given them a new way to see. She had taught them that true strength was not in fighting the elements, but in understanding them, that the greatest resources are often hidden. Buried beneath the surface of conventional wisdom, she lived out the rest of her days in her quiet home. A pillar of a community she had saved not with force, but with forgotten knowledge and a shovel. Years later, a journal of hers was found. On the last page, in a neat, careful hand, she had written a final thought, a summary of her entire philosophy. It read, "The surface shouts, but the deep earth whispers. A wise soul learns to listen to the whisper." She was right. We are all surrounded by the shouting of the surface world, the loud, confident voices of conventional wisdom telling us how things must be done. We are told that the well is dry, that the land is useless, that our unconventional ideas are follies. But what whispers have you been ignoring? What deep, quiet knowledge inherited from a grandparent or learned from a forgotten passion have you dismissed as impractical? Anya's greatest inheritance was not a dry well. It was the wisdom to see it as a doorway. Your own inheritance, your own unique knowledge is there. Your cave may be overgrown. Your well may appear to be dry. Start clearing the entrance. Start listening to the whisper. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are dramatized for narrative effect. The content presented here is for entertainment and informational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any construction or survival-related activities.